Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We are glad that you're with us once again for our Genesis Bible class study. We're studying Genesis chapter 36 and chapter 37 this week, and we're actually going to read chapter 37 in its entirety here in just a moment. As we begin this morning, once again with me as always is Troy. We're glad to have him as well. And we're going to start off with our review of Genesis on the key points, the things that are important to understanding the book as a whole and giving us a good launching place for understanding the Bible as a whole. You remember that Genesis is the book of beginnings. It is the book of generations, Toledat. And you'll find that word actually in Genesis 36, which we'll look at here in just a moment. But that's the key word, one of the key words of the entire book. You remember that Genesis follows four great events all through the first 11 chapters. The first one being creation, then the fall of mankind, then the great global worldwide flood of Genesis 6 and 7, and then finally finishing up with the Tower of Babel in Genesis 10 and 11. Once you get to chapter 12, we begin to follow four great men. The first one being Abraham, then his son Isaac, his son Jacob, and lastly, who we're going to be introduced to and get to know really well beginning today, is his son Joseph. Those are the four great men of Genesis. There are two major hinges on which Genesis turns. The first one being the promise of Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, and that is the promise that God, through the seed of the woman, would deal with the serpent, would crush his head. And the second of which is Genesis 12, 1 through 3, the promise made to Abram at that time about the promises that God was making to him if he would faithfully follow God. And you remember that that actually composes four different parts, that one promise. We call it the quad promise of Genesis. It consists of a people, a place, God's presence and his protection, and lastly, that God's got a plan to bless the entire world based upon the Abraham seed. As we get to our chapter this week and looking at these things, we're going to have, actually, Troy, if he wouldn't mind, to read Genesis chapter 37, and I will put this up on the screen for you. And this is the New King James Version if you're following along, but feel free to follow along in your own translation. Go ahead, Troy.
Alrighty, here we go, 37, verse 1. Now Jacob dwelt in the land where his father was a stranger in the land of Canaan. And this is the history of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age. Also he made him a tunic of many colors. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Now Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. So he said to them, "Please hear this dream which I have dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Then behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright. And indeed your sheaves stood all around and bowed down to my sheaf." And his brothers said to him, "Shall you indeed reign over us? Or shall you indeed have dominion over us?" So they hated him even more for his dream and for his words. And then he dreamed still another dream and told it to his brothers and said, "Look, I have dreamed another dream, and this time the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to me." So he told it to his father and his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come to bow down to the earth before you?" And his brothers envied him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Then his brothers went to feed their father's flock in Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers feeding the flock in Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." So he said, "Here I am." Then he said to him, "Please go and see if it is well with your brothers and well with the flocks, and bring back word to me." So he sent him out of the valley of Hebron, and he went to Shechem. Now a certain man found him, and there he was, wandering in the field. And the man asked, saying, "What are you seeking?" So he said, "I'm seeking my brothers. Please tell me where they are feeding their flocks." And the man said, "They've departed from here, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" And so Joseph went after his brothers and found him in Dothan. So when they saw him afar off, even before he came near them, they conspired against him to kill him. And then they said to one another, "Look, this dreamer is coming. Come, therefore let us now kill him, cast him into some pit. And we shall say, 'Some wild beast has devoured him.' We shall see what will become of his dreams." But Reuben heard it, and he delivered him out of their hands and said, let us not kill him. And Reuben said to them, shed no blood, but cast him into this pit, which is in the wilderness, and do not lay a hand on him, that he might deliver him out of their hands and bring him back to his father. So it came to pass when Joseph had come to his brothers that they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the tunic of many colors that was on him. Then they took him and cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty. There was no water in it. And they sat down to eat a meal. Then they lifted their eyes and looked. And there was coming a company of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels, bearing spices, balm, and myrrh on their way to carry them down to Egypt. So Judah said to his brothers, what profit is there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh. And his brothers listened. Then Midianite traders passed by, so the brothers pulled Joseph up, lifted him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. Then Reuben returned to the pit, and indeed Joseph was not in the pit, and he tore his clothes, and he returned to his brothers and said, the lad is no more, and I, where shall I go? So they took Joseph's tunic, killed a kid of the goats, and dipped the tunic in blood. Then they sent the tunic of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, we have found this. Do you know whether it is your son's tunic or not? And he recognized it, and he said, it is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Without doubt, Joseph is torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his clothes, put sackcloth on his waist, and mourned for his son many days. And all his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him. But he refused to be comforted. And he said, for I shall go down into the grave to my son in mourning. Thus his father wept for him. Now the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard.
All right, Troy, thanks for reading that. And I know it's a lengthy reading, but it's good to refamiliarize ourselves with the story of Joseph, and especially getting us and setting the scene for what's going to happen to him in the future. Before we talk about Joseph, let's talk about what happened there in Genesis chapter 36. It's interesting to think that here is Esau, the brother of Jacob, and Esau's story in this biblical narrative in Genesis chapter 36 is basically over. It is interesting to think about the fact that the only reason why he's ever mentioned again is because his descendants figure into the story of Israel. And that's basically where Genesis chapter 36 is. You begin to look here just a few moments about going over Genesis 36 quickly, and we see this is the genealogy. Here is our word that we mentioned at the very beginning once again, the Toledot of Esau, who is Edom. He is the father of the Edomites, and you note that God didn't leave Esau high and dry when it comes to blessings, did he? You remember that Jacob had his blessing. He stole Esau's blessing from Isaac way back in Genesis about 25, 26. And what happened is that Esau then hated Jacob, but he begged for a blessing from his father, and his father went ahead and blessed him. And you note that God is blessing Esau as well. But what do we know about Esau's descendants just from this lengthy chapter where there's a whole lot of names that are written? What do you notice about that, Troy? Can you help us?
Well, there is a big mess of them.
Okay.
A lot of people. And then as we look at that, as we go through and look at that genealogy, we see that there was a lot of royalty, a lot of chiefs, a lot of kings, chiefs, and I think in the King James they're dukes, or something like that.
Interesting.
Yeah. And notice in verse 7, Esau takes off. He gets out of the region because he has so much wealth, and he can't compete with Jacob, and so he has to take his leave and move his stuff out of the way. And when you first read that verse 6, you read, well, he left. He got one translation. He left from Jacob's face, turned from Jacob's face, and you wonder, were they not getting? Well, he was so wealthy. He was blessed in that sense as well. A lot of descendants.
And you see that term, as we mentioned, genealogy, Toledot, the book of generations. Esau seems like he's got three different words or three different characteristics of his genealogy. You remember that Troy had just mentioned that he's got sons and daughters, and that's in about the first 8 verses. He has the genealogy of the ones who are called the chiefs of the sons of Edom, verse 15. Here are these people that are obviously high and mighty, we might say. But then you also find verses 31 to 39. These were the kings who reigned from the land of Edom before any king reigned over Israel. Before Israel was ever established as a nation, before they ever had, before they ever begged Samuel for a king in 1 Samuel 8, here is Edom being blessed by God and having their kings already beginning to reign over this land. Esau's story, as we mentioned, is at an end. Why does the Bible not follow Esau's line? Isn't he important to the biblical narrative? What's the context in which he's mentioned again?
Usually, well, as we read, it's negative. But at the same time, the Edomites show up quite a bit. Mm-hmm. They show up. Moses and the Israelites in the wilderness. They gave him trouble. They gave them trouble. The Edomites.
Right.
The people were discouraged in Numbers 21:4 because they couldn't go through. They had to go around because of the Edomites, and so they're prolific, but they're also a problem. And throughout the history of the Old Testament, and it's interesting to me that in Deuteronomy 2, you find them skirting the mountain, and then God says to them, Moses, you've skirted this mountain long enough, turn northward, command the people, you are about to pass through the territory of your brethren, the descendants of Esau, mm-hmm. who live in Seir, which is where he did take off to. And then he says, verse 5, don't meddle or don't provoke war with them. I will not give you any of their land, because he said, I have given Mount Seir to Esau as a possession. Mm-hmm. So again, he's blessed. He's not, like you said, God loved Jacob but hated Esau, his dad, and God too. And so you have that idea of, okay, he's blessed, but he's still not right, right. in God's eyes.
He wasn't the one that God chose to bless the world through. Mm-hmm. It was the line of Jacob that he chose to take. And Troy mentioned what the Galatians talks about. God chose Jacob over Esau. God chose the younger over the older, and it's God's choice, and that was who He chose. And so Esau, even though he was blessed, he was not the heir of this promise that was made all the way back to Abraham. And remember that the fact that Esau and Edom are mentioned some 200 times in the Bible after this. However, Israel and Jacob is mentioned some 2,000 times in the Bible. And the only reason why we ever see Esau / Edom again is because that they figure into the story of Israel. Yeah. You might go to the Old Testament prophet of Obadiah and realize that that's a condemnation on Esau, Edom, because Esau, they saw their brethren Israel in jeopardy in difficult times whenever there was a foreign nation invading, and they're standing across the River Jordan and kind of rubbing their hands together and go, they're finally getting what they deserve. And Obadiah condemns them. God through Obadiah condemns them, and that's a consequence of them. But the only reason why they're ever mentioned again in Scripture is because they figure into the story that we're following, and that is the children of Jacob. When we get over to Genesis chapter 37, which is the next one, which we just read for you just a few moments ago, we come to the last major narrative / character in the book of Genesis. And note also that this narrative begins with a Toledot. This is the history of Jacob, but it immediately turns its attention and follows the son of the firstborn son of the favorite wife, that is Rachel's son Joseph. And it talks about him and his plight that's going to lead us all the way into this narrative that follows in Egypt. It introduces Jacob as a pilgrim, as a stranger in the land of Canaan, and the child Joseph who becomes a stranger in the land of Egypt. What's going on in Jacob's family here in the first 4 verses that we can see, Troy, that shows that this is not really all sunshine and roses as far as their family dynamic goes?
Yeah, so and throughout that chapter as well.
Yes.
The brothers seem to just get angrier and angrier, and then they hated him even more. And you look at verse 2. Joseph is sent with his brothers, but then brings back a bad report of them. So I don't think, first of all, you already know that he's Jacob's favorite from the past.
Right.
And then now Jacob comes back. You can call him Joseph, you can call him a tattletale. We don't know why there was a bad report. At least I don't know why the bad report, what it was about. But then you have him being loved more than his brothers. They hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. I think that's interesting too. They were just, they couldn't say a good word. My question that I had as I was reading this, and I'd even thought it before, why was Joseph the favorite son? Verse 3 says, because he was the son of his old age. But was that the youngest son?
Well, Benjamin was the youngest son.
Yeah.
And you remember that Rachel died during childbirth whenever she was giving birth to Benjamin. Son of his old age. Interesting. Never really thought about that, but that's right there in verse 3, isn't it?
Yeah, but then later on, so Benjamin is the youngest, and he will be favored later on, and we'll see that in 42:4 when the brothers are sent to Egypt, and Jacob says, no, don't take Benjamin. Something bad might happen. So I just wondered how the brothers felt about Benjamin after. Well, now Joseph is gone, so he'll favor Benjamin, which he seems to be very protective of. But yes, my question came up. Why was he his favorite son? Because his favorite wife had two kids. It's just the son of his old age. Anyway, I'll move on. But his brothers hated him more and more and more.
Well, and realize that the Genesis writer gives credence to the understanding that there is a severe division between these children. Just looking at verse 2, as Troy mentioned, the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah. It doesn't say he was with his brothers. Right. There is an obvious distinction, and then he just completely clarifies in verse 3 and says he loved Joseph more than all of his children. Verse 4, he reiterates that he loved him more than all of his children. He loves him so much that he gave him a tunic of many colors. Verse 4, when his brothers saw their father loved him more than all his brothers. Again, it's like being hammered into our heads that here is a child that it seems like through no fault of his own, just by being the firstborn child of the favorite wife, he loved Rachel far more than he loved Leah, or certainly the handmaids that were given to him. It's these ladies are trying to get back at each other and one up each other, so to speak. Now he's got all these kids, and Joseph is the one that he chooses to favor, and that's excuse me. One man said, when parents play favorites, they don't do that favorite any favors. And that's exactly what happens to Joseph. You find the phrase that's repeated, not only that father loves, but also brothers hated. Verse 4, brothers saw his father loved him more than all his brothers. They hated him. They could not speak peaceably to him. Sometimes that's the case with children that get on each other's nerves, that parents have to step in and do something about. But Joseph has done nothing to deserve this as far as we can see. What event then exasperates this hatred that they have for him? What events happen to Joseph that stirs this vitriol and this anger and this animosity of his brothers?
Sorry. We read that he is given the tunic, and I lost why. He's given the tunic, loved him more, and then his brother see that tunic, and then he starts having these dreams.
Right.
And he went ahead and told them the dream. And then why did he feel the need to tell them the dream? I mean, if they're already mean to him, I'm not saying he's kind of not too smart. I just wondered why he felt the need. Anyway, he has these dreams, they're prophetic dreams. He already has a tunic, and then he tells the brothers, and Joseph, he probably could have thought through this. I don't know. I'm not saying he was wrong, but could have thought through this. Okay, should I tell him? Should I not? This isn't going to make me popular. He could have sat on it, and it still would have come true. It still would have come to fruition.
Right.
And then Jacob kind of jumps all over him for sharing those dreams.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's interesting, verse 10. But his brothers, what in the world? And then they refer to him sarcastically later on as, there comes that dreamer. We'll talk about that, but Jacob could have been offended he was offended by the prophetic dream, Jacob himself, but he didn't forget about it either. I don't know if that answers any other questions that you
It does.
posed.
It does. And, looking at him sharing these dreams, it could have been something that was so impressive in his mind that he couldn't but share it.
Yeah.
There's sometimes that you've got these, hallmark moments that there's something to it. And maybe he's looking for clarification. Maybe he's looking for clarity and understanding these things and realizing something has happened to me. These dreams are different than the other ones that I've ever had. And just opening up and sharing these things. Number one, the biblical writer emphasizes here in Genesis 37 that his brothers had knowledge of what it was that he dreamed about. For right or for wrong, that he shared them. And number two, that these two dreams are going to become very, very important as the continued narrative of Joseph progresses. Keep in mind that he had two dreams here in Genesis chapter 37. We'll come back to this again, Lord willing, in a couple of weeks and notice some things about that. But he has these two dreams where there are his chiefs that are bowing down to him, and the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars are bowing down to them. And note that the brothers accurately interpret these dreams. Mm-hmm. His father accurately interprets these dreams. Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come and bow down to you? And verse 11 is another key. His brothers hate him. They can't speak peaceably to him. But note that they also, the Bible says, envied him. They envied him. What do we know about envy and what envy is going to do? Envy is going to try and destroy the object of its desire, either passive aggressively or openly and very dangerously. You remember that Jesus in Mark 15 verse 10 went and stood before Pilate, and the Bible says that Pilate knew that the Jews had handed him over because of envy. They could not stand the fact that Jesus was more popular than them, and he had this knowledge and he had this power, and the reason why they delivered him to Pilate was envy. Same motivation here in Genesis 37 and verse 11. His brothers deliver him and want to sell him into slavery, kill him initially because of envy. We find the first moving pieces of this in Genesis 37 verse 12. Joseph's father commissions him to go check on his brothers. Where were they supposed to be, and where did he have to go to find them?
Supposed to be in Shechem.
Okay.
And which is quite a bit north of where they started. And then they end up, do you say Dothan or Dothan? What do you say?
I say Dothan.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've heard it both ways today. Anyway, so they end up in Dothan, which you think about Joseph's trip already. He seems like he's by himself. Mm-hmm. That man finds him wandering around the field looking, well, I knew they were here. They're supposed to be here. And then he continues to look for them. But that's quite a trip already from where he started. And then he continues on to find them in Dothan, like 70 or 80 miles away. I mean, we think, well, he's going to go out and stand on a hill and look for him and for them. But this is quite a bit of walking that he's doing.
It was quite a jaunt. And I kind of wonder about the word Shechem, because you remember in Genesis 35 where we left off last time that Israel had kind of become a stink in Shechem, killing all the males.
I had that thought too. It's dangerous.
It could very well be that Israel thought, okay, I wonder what those brothers are up to if they're busy deceiving, deliberately hurting people, and thinking, okay, I need to get my number one on this and send Joseph up to check on them. And Joseph goes for the 50-mile trek, ends up having to go an extra 20 to 25 miles, 30 miles at the most to Dothan in order to get them. And this is the last time that Joseph is going to see his home, being a pilgrim, a stranger here in Israel, and he would not return back to this land until almost 500 years later at the end of Joshua 24, verse 32. That's a good margin verse to write there. As Joseph goes, sent him out of the valley of Hebron. He doesn't come back until Joshua chapter 24 and verse 32, where Israel comes and they settle in the land after they've conquered it, and they bury Joseph's bones there in the land of Israel. His brothers see him. They say, "Okay, what are they planning to do? What does it seem like they're? How does it seem like they regard his dreams?" They use the word a couple of times, don't they?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, master of dreams. There comes that dreamer. They sarcastically referring to him as the master of dreams, like the king of dreamers or whatever. Yeah. But they see him really far away, and that gives them an opportunity to have this conversation about him. Well, when he gets here, and he's not their favorite. He's already told on him once. Right. That's one thing that I've wondered. Okay, so he told on us at one point. What's he going to go back and say now? Mm-hmm. I mean, now we're absolutely not where we're supposed to be, and then they just start making the plans to take care of him, take him out of the game. Yeah, we're going to take him out of the game.
Let's kill him. Let's cast him into a pit. We've got some premeditated fratricide here that's going on, and we'll just simply say to Dad that some wild beast has devoured him, and then we shall see what shall become of his dreams. There is an acknowledgement, it seems like, that the brothers realize that his dreams are prophetic. Mm-hmm. And part of that envy that they may have felt at the very beginning of this, a couple of verses earlier as we saw, could be realizing that this dream that he had was something that God was trying to accomplish in his life. And it's almost like, going back to Jacob and going back to Isaac and trying to subvert the will of God by, inserting our own selfish will and selfish wishes to try and keep that from happening. That didn't work out for Isaac whenever he was blessing Jacob and Esau, and it's certainly not going to work out for Joseph's brothers whenever they're trying to keep the dreams from coming to pass. They realize there's something prophetic about it, and they decide that they're going to try and alter the plan. Reuben speaks up here in verse 21. He seemingly is the one who alters the plan from fratricide, from murder, cold-blooded murder, to simply throwing in the pit. What might be his motivation? What does it say about the Bible that he wanted to do in order to that? And what might have motivated him to want to say those things?
Well, he'd already messed up before. And now he is, what I get from this, he's the oldest. Mm-hmm. He's going to be held accountable.
Right.
He's going to have to, and so if he'll be seen as irresponsible. He let Joseph, his dad's favorite son, die, and it's all on his shoulders, which is interesting because he's going to go along with the plan later on, pretend that Joseph had been killed, and so it wasn't going to change Jacob's perception of him. Mm-hmm. But he goes along and he goes along with the plan, and Reuben's already in the doghouse, silently. It's interesting that Jacob hadn't said anything about it, but apparently it had something. There were ramifications from it.
Yes, absolutely. And just to indicate, whenever Joseph confronts his brothers later in Egypt, I was noticing Genesis chapter 42 and verse. Let's see, where was it? 42 verse 21. An indication that Joseph was, after they beat him up and threw him in the pit, he was in there for a little while.
Yeah, he's calling out.
Yeah, verse 21 says, they were saying to one another, "We're truly guilty concerning our brother, for we saw the anguish of his soul when he pleaded with us, and we would not hear. Therefore this distress has come upon us." We don't know how long Joseph was in that pit, but it seems like he was long enough in there to, cry out and to try and plead with his brothers for mercy. And because they hated him, because they were so invested in destroying him at this time, they were completely cold-bloodedly
just ignored him,
ignoring him and ignoring his cries. And can you imagine, realizing after they'd gotten back to their father and had deceived him, how heavily that might weigh on a person to realize that the reason why my father is grieving is because of something that I did. And hearing his cries of anguish, maybe sometimes at night whenever they were going to sleep, I just can't imagine dealing with that kind of guilt and that kind of mess that they've tried to sweep under the rug here in this situation. What is what does Judah suggest then here at this time?
A funny thing to me. He says, okay, we could actually make some money off of this.
Yeah.
We can make some money, and so 20 shekels of silver, is that a lot? Well, we'll see that that there's more money involved for them in the future because of Joseph. But look at what he says in 27. Come and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him. Now, all of a sudden, he's changing the tune. For he is our brother and our flesh. Now we care about him because he might make us some money. And so they go and deceive his debt. But that's a trip. I don't know if they knew that they were going to Egypt, but that's quite a trip.
Yes.
That they sent him on. But I thought that was ironic to hear Judah is, let's kill him. No, let's not. We don't have to kill him. We can make some dough off this.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We got 20 shekels of silver coming to us. Joseph on his way now to Egypt as they sell him to these Midianite, Ishmaelite traders for 20 shekels of silver. Egypt, the journey from where they are now in Dothan all the way down to Egypt is about 350 miles. Here's a guy who just thought he was going initial 50 miles to go check on his brothers and come back. And now he's on his way, sold to these people there in a situation where he cannot do anything about it. And he's now going 350 miles from home. When they come back, Reuben returns to the pit. And Joseph wasn't in the pit. It says, verse 29, he tore his clothes. He returned to his brother and said, the lad is more, and I no more. And where shall I go?
Yeah. Doesn't want to go home.
That's right. Troy alluded to the fact that Reuben was already in the doghouse for having a sexual relationship with one of his father's wives, concubines, and now he's thinking, probably as the firstborn, I am so dead for this. I am so never getting over this. And they took Joseph's tunic. They killed a kid of the goats. They dipped the tunic in the blood. They sent the tunic of many colors, brought it to their father, and said, we found this. Do you not know whether it's your son's or not? He recognized it, said, it is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Without doubt, Joseph is torn to pieces.
Because who wouldn't recognize that tunic?
Exactly.
I mean, it's the only one like it, so it must be.
Do you think this is your son's?
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you think, Dad?
Yeah.
Did they really lie about what happened to Joseph?
No, they deceived him, obviously, but Jacob he filled in the gaps with his own imagination. It wasn't like, well, he was killed on the way or whatever. He was saying, without doubt, Joseph is torn to pieces. It's not a question in his mind, a wild beast has devoured him. And then those two words, without doubt. I am sure that that's what happened.
Right.
He filled in the blanks. Now, he, like I said, he was very deceived. They let him believe that, which is kind of cruel.
Yes.
Well, not kind of. It is cruel to let him believe that. And then, and then the daughters rose up. The sons, what does it say? All his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. So the daughters, do they know what's going on? I don't know if they do, but the brothers do, and then they rally around him and go through the motions of, at any given time, they could have said, no, he's not dead.
We sold him.
We just sold him. He's still alive somewhere. But they don't. They just let him go through that mourning process.
Yeah, and how much do you have to hate somebody?
Yeah.
And envy somebody to realize here's a person who is wallowing in sorrow, and Jacob is going to be wallowing in sorrow for years and years
He
and
says
years.
the rest of his life.
Yeah, when we come back to him in several years after after Joseph has been gone, from Potiphar's house to prison to Pharaoh's house, and as you're talking about a number of almost a decade. It seems like that when we come back to him and see him again, he's still going to be in the same mental prison of despair and discouragement and mourning for his son. And you get a sense that the brothers kind of underestimate the mourning that their father would go through in the process, the grieving process. And when it comes to him, then they come to him there in verse 35 and kind of, I don't know, try and prod him out of it and say, Dad, all right, it's time to kind of get over this. You know that he's in a better place. Whatever people want to say to try and to encourage people
but they could have told him the truth and ended his misery.
They absolutely could have.
Like I said, it's cruel. But, were they worried, okay, if we tell him, how much trouble would we be into? And maybe that was their motivation, telling a lie to get out of a lie to get out of a lie. But I think that's very cruel, what they did to Jacob.
And what's really interesting is the Bible doesn't entertain our fantasies and our curiosities about how this situation was ultimately resolved. Because, again, you've read through the rest of the book of Genesis. You know that everything's going to turn out to where Joseph's alive. But it doesn't ever read that Israel comes back and then confronts the other 11 brothers and the daughters or whoever had knowledge of this and says, no, wait a minute. You remember what happened years ago when you dipped that thing in blood and gave it to me? There's never really any kind of coming to this head of the situation that these brothers create here on this occasion. And we don't read about there being ever really any resolution in Jacob's life and in Joseph's life, other than the fact that Joseph forgave his brothers for what they did.
I wonder if Jacob took his cue.
Yeah, that could very well be.
I mean, here this kid is, this guy is my son. Could punish my put my other sons to death, and he doesn't. And so, how grateful are we that he doesn't, and he takes us in, and
absolutely.
Good thoughts.
How does the chapter end?
Segue.
A segue.
Yeah.
Okay. Midianites had sold him into Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and the captain of the guard. We'll look next week at a strange chapter, Genesis chapter 38, because we leave this narrative of Joseph and go and follow Judah just for a little while. And Genesis 37 kind of leaves us on a cliffhanger to say, what will become of Joseph? Tune in next week to see. But we're actually going to have to wait 2 weeks, Lord willing, again, before we understand what's going on in Joseph's life and how that works, because there's kind of a detour that we have to take in Genesis 38 to talk about Judah and some really, really strange things that are going on in his life. But before we leave Genesis 37, Troy, what are some applications that you see based upon what we've talked about today and looking at this really strange and difficult family dynamic?
Well, I don't know about 37, but going back to 36, and I'll let you do 37. It struck me as I finished that little section, Esau was incredibly blessed, but God blesses the godless. And doesn't mean they were right. And then another one, being wealthy, seeming like you've got it all, doesn't matter if you haven't found favor in God's eyes. Because if we look at Esau and you don't know the history and you don't know the future, you just look at that chapter and you can read it and you think, well, he ended up doing really well for himself.
Right.
But if you don't know that he missed, if you just open up the Bible, the very first time to read 36, you would think Esau was the man.
Yeah.
And so if you don't know his past and you don't know what will become of him and his family, he just looks good. But he hadn't found favor in God's eyes. In fact, you'll hear negative things about him later on, and then Joseph. Last thing, Joseph's dreams. I feel like Joseph knew exactly what they meant, because Joseph would be known for being able to interpret dreams.
Right.
And And I don't know if the case is that he told his brothers the meaning of his dreams, or like you said, his brothers figured it out, because Jacob figured it out too. But they all seem to understand these things that are coming up. And I think that, not that we're going to have supernatural dreams or whatever, but I think when we hear, I know for sure, when we read the Word, we've got to figure out what it means for us. And it's not a negative thing for us. There are warnings, but we will be blessed. We can look forward to being blessed because of what we read in the Bible and what God said. Here's what it's going to look like. Mm-hmm. And so there, I'm done.
Well, and God making promises to us and doing so in the revelation of His Word and what the Holy Spirit inspired the apostles to do and say. We have the promises. They weren't revealed to us in dreams. They were revealed to us in the written Word, but it doesn't make them any less valid than the dreams that were made to Joseph, made known to Joseph, and then Joseph's interpretation of those things, and just waiting and biding his time until those things came to pass. You look at the Christian life and how we've got this wonderful treasure trove of promises that God has given us and God has made to us. Again, not revealed in dreams, but revealed through the Word. And Joseph had to wait 4 years before God fulfilled those promises completely. And all the time during his waiting, you find these circumstances that seem to get worse and worse and worse for him until the point where God begins to exalt him. And Joseph, through all this waiting and through all this difficulty, did not become jaded. He didn't become bitter and didn't become angry at his life or his circumstances. And I've got to see the parallel as Christians. There may be really horrible things that come to pass in our lives. I don't know if it can be any more horrible than being sold by brothers and beaten and left for dead and then sold into slavery. But you understand that there's things that we encounter in our lives that are horrible and nothing that we'd wish on anybody. But those things that we have happen to us should not diminish our trust and our hope in the promises that God has made us. Mm-hmm. Because we know that God is bringing about those things, and there's going to be one day that our faith is going to become sight, and where God's promises are going to be made full, and where they're going to be revealed to us, and everything that we've waited for and everything that we've been promised is going to come to pass. And that's a wonderful, wonderful lesson to take from the life of Joseph in patience and suffering, but also confident trust in the promises of God. I think the lesson that we can get out of this Genesis 37 is envy and hatred are only going to ever cloud our good judgment. Envy and hatred are only ever going to cloud our good judgment. When you get to the book of Colossians especially, Colossians starts telling us, and Paul starts telling us through this book and to these Christians, that there are certain things that we need to cast off as Christians, to put off envy and malice and strife and all of those things that can really keep us from looking at Jesus Christ the way that we ought to, keeping our eyes focused on Him, Colossians 3 verse 1, and putting those things off because primarily they're going to keep us from living a Christian life that's free to grow the way that Christ wants us to, that's free to glorify God the way that we're supposed to, and the free to put on love, which is the bond of perfection, down in Colossians chapter 3, verses 13 and following. And you look at our lives and the way that God wants us to conduct ourselves, and really the only thing that our hatred and our envy and our jealousy are ever going to do is just drag us down to the point where, we end up in this bitter prison to where we can't seemingly get out. Any others that you can think of, Troy? Any others that you want to add to these?
I think you did a good job. I know you did a good job. So I'm gonna leave it with what we said, and I'm just gonna sit here for the rest of the time and stare at my camera.
Well, it won't be long because we are done with our Bible class. We're glad that you've joined us once again. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope these lessons are a blessing to you, and I hope that they help you to understand more about Genesis, more about where we've come from, but also to give us hope and comfort and patience for the future, just like Romans 15:4 talks about. Thank you so much for tuning in. May God bless you as you serve Him.
You're dismissed.
You're dismissed.